Myriad forms of human suffering. One of the main objectives so far in this discussion is to distinguish the dukkha in the Four Noble Truths from the dukkha in the three characteristics, and also to see how these two forms of dukkha are related. In the previous sections, various attributes or descriptions of suffering have been introduced. Note that these descriptions need not be held too strictly. The Buddha presented them as simple and clear examples for establishing a basic understanding of suffering. Yet many of these kinds of suffering vary according to time and place. It would be possible to make a list of problems and afflictions that are specific, say, to the modern era. Yet, in the end, all of these variations on suffering may be summarized by the Buddha's words. In brief, the five aggregates subject to clinging or suffering. At this point, let us look at some of the classifications of dukkha found in the scriptures. The dukkha most often analysed in the scriptures is dukkha of the Four Noble Truths. Because it concerns human beings directly, we should reflect upon this suffering to be released from it through Dhamma practice. As for the all-inclusive dukkha of the three characteristics, it is illustrated just enough for an accurate understanding of reality. The chief, most frequently mentioned groups of dukkha in the scriptures are listed below. The 12 kinds of dukkha. This group elucidates the meaning of dukkha in the Four Noble Truths. 1. Birth, jati. Birth is suffering because it is a basis for various kinds of affliction. Gabo kanti mulaka dukkha. The suffering of confinement in the womb. A fetus dwells in a dark, stifling place full of repugnant substances. Gaba parihara na mulaka dukkha. The suffering of carrying the womb. Whenever the mother moves or eats hot, cold or spicy food, it affects the child in the womb. Gaba havi pati mulaka dukkha. The suffering from misfortunes of the womb, for example, ectopic pregnancy, stillbirth or caesarean operation. Vijaya na mulaka dukkha. The suffering of childbirth, including the pounding, twisting, squeezing and severe pain while exiting the narrow canal. Bahini ka mana mulaka dukkha. The suffering of emergence into the outside world. The newly born infant, whose skin is sensitive as a wound, feels acute pain when handled and washed. Atupaka mamulaka dukkha. The suffering that results from self-inflicted actions, for example suicide, extreme asceticism, refusing to eat due to resentment or other self-injurious acts. Parupaka mamulaka dukkha. The suffering caused by others' deeds, for example being assaulted, murdered or imprisoned. 2. Aging. Aging weakens the organs, the faculties, example the eyes and ears, function defectively, Vitality wanes and agility is lost. The skin wrinkles, it is no longer fair and lustrous. Memory becomes incoherent and faulty. A person's control, both internal and external, weakens, causing great physical and mental distress. 3. Death, Marana. If one has committed bad deeds during the course of one's life, they appear as mental images, nimitta, at the time of death. One must be separated from cherished people and things. The constituent parts of the body cease to perform their duties. There may be intense physical pain, and one is impotent to remedy the situation. 4. Grief, Sukha. For example, from the loss of a relative. 5. Lamentation, Parideva. For example, keening at the loss of a relative. 6. Physical pain, Dukkha. For example, wounds, sprains and sickness. 7. Distress, Domanassa, anguish, which causes crying, beating one's breast and committing suicide, etc. 8. Frustration, Upayasa, despair. For instance, the torment of unmitigated grief. 9. Association with disagreeable people or things, Apiya Sampayoga. For example, the need to engage with a person whom one detests. 10. Separation from cherished people or things, Piya Vipaya Yoga. For example, separation from loved ones or the loss of possessions. 11. Not obtaining what one wants, disappointment, Ichi Talaba. 12. The Five Aggregates, which are the foundation for clinging, Upadana Kanda. All of the aforementioned suffering stems from the Five Aggregates. As objects of clinging, to sum up, one can say that suffering is the Five Aggregates of clinging. Okay, the 2 Dukkha. 1. Paticana Dukkha, concealed, not clearly manifest suffering, for example, a latent earache or toothache, or the mind smouldering with the fires of lust and anger. 2. Apitachana Dukkha, overt suffering, for example, being pricked by a thorn, whipped or cut by a knife. The 2 Dukkha. B. Pariyaya Dukkha, indirect or implicit Dukkha, i.e. every form of Dukkha mentioned above, excluding painful feeling Dukkha Vedana. 2. Niparinyaya Dukkha, explicit Dukkha, which is also called Dukkha Dukkha, the feeling of pain. The Mahanidesa, the Kulani Desa, offer many additional categories of Dukkha. For example, for matter of simplicity, they can be sorted into the following groups. A. Suffering as birth, Jati Dukkha, aging, Jara Dukkha, illness, Vyadi Dukkha, death, Marana Dukkha, sorrow, lamentation, pain, anguish, and despair. Soka Parideva Dukkha Domanassa Upayasa. B. The suffering of hell beings, Nirayika Dukkha, of animals, Tirachana Yonika Dukkha, of ghosts, Piti Visayika Dukkha, and of humans, Manu Saka Dukkha. C. The suffering experienced from taking birth in a womb, Gabhokanti Mulaka Dukkha, from living in a womb, gabe titi mulaka dukkha, and from exiting a womb, gabba wuttana mulaka dukkha. The suffering inherent in one who is born, jata su pani bandika dukkha. The suffering of one who is born due to being dependent on others, jata sa para deyaka dukkha. Self-inflicted suffering, atupakama dukkha, and suffering inflicted by others, parupakama dukkha. Pain, dukkha dukkha, the dukkha of formations, sankhara dukkha, and dukkha inherent in chains, viparinama dukkha. Various kinds of diseases, for example eye, ear and ear diseases, 35 kinds of diseases are mentioned. Illness resulting from 8 causes, including bile, phlegm and wind, or a combination of these causes. Illness resulting from changes in the weather and irregular exercise. Afflictions due to other people's actions, for example being murdered or imprisoned, and the effect of personal actions. Suffering owing to cold, heat, hunger, thirst, defecation, urination, wind, sun, flies, mosquitoes and crawling creatures. Suffering resulting from the death of one's mother, father, brother, sister or child. Suffering due to loss of relatives, loss of possessions, loss through sickness, loss of moral conduct, and loss of cherished views and opinions. In the Maha Dukkha Kanda and the Kula Dukkha Kanda Suttas, the Buddha described many examples of the mass of suffering, Dukkha Kanda. The plights afflicting humans because of sense desire, they are summarized as follows. The hardship or even loss of life due to one's occupation, the disappointment experienced when one's labour is in vain, the suffering in trying to protect acquired wealth, the grief that ensues when such protection is unsuccessful and wealth is lost, for example to thieves or fire, the disputes and violence between rulers, between householders, between parents and children, between siblings, and between friends, leading to death and serious injury. The slaughter and severe agony of war, the injury and death resulting from invasion, the committal of crimes, for example burglary or adultery, followed by arrest and conviction, and ending in torture and execution. The performance of physical, verbal and mental misdeeds leading after death to states of deprivation, perdition and hell. More references to dukkha are located throughout the scriptures and commentaries. In some places the descriptions have no specific name, as in the examples of the Maha and the Kula Dukkha Kanda Suttas mentioned above, while in others dukkha is identified by special terms such as samsara dukkha, apaya dukkha, suffering of the lower realms, vata mulaka dukkha, suffering through the round of rebirth, or ahara pariyita dukkha, to list just a few. It would be possible to elaborate much more on this subject of suffering, since human beings encounter so many problems, including the afflictions faced by all living creatures. and suffering specific to certain time periods, regions, and circumstances. But it is not necessary to offer a drawn-out explanation. More important is to realize that the many scriptural descriptions exist to promote an understanding of the true nature of suffering. With this understanding, we can respond correctly to suffering. We acknowledge that we must engage with suffering rather than resort to evasion, self-deception, or to the denial that either suffering does not exist or that it cannot affect us. Such deception only creates more complex problems and more severe affliction. Our responsibility is rather that of facing and understanding suffering, parinya kicha, to have victory over it and to be freed from it. This is the practice of walking the path leading to suffering's cessation. A cessation both temporary and permanent.